August 14th, 1944. Camp Hearn, Texas. The steam rose first, soft, white, harmless. And 37 German women flinched as if the shower pipes were guns. I remember the smell before anything else, not the sweat that clung to our uniforms after months of marching and captivity. Not the dust of Texas, which settled on our skin like a second, unwanted layer of life. No, what hit me first was something far stranger. A faint sweetness, a clean scent, something floral, mild, almost hopeful. Shampoo. For a moment, I thought I was hallucinating. 5 months without washing my hair had turned my scalp into a battlefield of oil, grit, and dried sweat. Most days, I tried not to imagine what I looked like under the knots and grime. The others were the same, hair matted, faces hollow, uniforms stiff from salt and dust. We had been captured in France in early spring, processed with cold water aboard a ship, then loaded onto trains that carried us deeper and deeper into America. At each stop, New Jersey, Ohio, Missouri, the world outside the train windows grew larger, newer, impossibly alive. And now, here in Camp Hearn, Texas, the Americans were offering us something I had not seen since before the war. A real shower, a hot one, with soap, with towels, with shampoo. It made no sense. The room we stood in had concrete floors stained with years of mineral water. Rows of iron pipes ran across the ceiling like ribs, their joints wrapped in canvas to keep them from dripping. A steel boiler rumbled against the far wall, breathing heat into the room. Beside it, a simple switch, just a small black paddle, waited to release the water. A pump outside the barracks thumped steadily, keeping the pressure up. These were ordinary American items. Ordinary to them, but unimaginable to us. A crate of Army-issued towels sat open on a bench, each one folded in neat rectangles, thick cotton, cream-colored, stamped U.S. 1943. A wire basket held bars of GI yellow soap, edges sharp and unused, and on a nearby shelf, lined up as if for inspection, stood bottles, actual bottles, of Palmolive shampoo, their green labels bright under the electric lights. Electric lights. We had not seen those in months either. The women around me whispered in German, voices trembling, disbelief tightening every word. Warum machen Sie das? Is this real? Why give this to us? No one had an answer. Our shoes squeaked on the damp floor as we shifted uncertainly, still packed close together like the frightened prisoners we were. For so long, bathing had meant cold water, humiliation, inspection, punishment. Cleanliness was not comfort. It was control. A metal door opened with a hollow clang. 2 American soldiers stepped inside. Their uniforms were crisp despite the heat, sleeves rolled, boots polished. They carried nothing but clipboards and patience. One of them, a tall, sun-tanned man with a sergeant's patch and kind eyes, set down a stack of fresh towels. "Ladies," he said in slow, careful English, "the water is hot. You'll take turns. Shampoo here, towels there. No rush." He spoke as if we were guests, as if we had not been taught to expect brutality from the very people standing before us. Behind him, a young American private, his freckles bright against his pale face, twisted a valve near the boiler. The pipes overhead began to hiss. Steam, warm and fragrant, drifted into the room again. And we flinched. Every one of us. I felt my chest tighten, my breath caught halfway. The sound of rushing water, so ordinary, so harmless, struck us like a memory we were not ready to face. In Europe, saunas, bathhouses, and warm water had vanished from life long before the front collapsed. Soap had become a treasure traded on the black market. Shampoo was a rumor. Bathing had turned into a 5-minute rinse in freezing water when the pumps worked and when the bombs were not falling. America, however, seemed to live in a different universe. We had glimpsed it during our transit. Small towns with neon diner signs, trucks moving crates of fruit, families hanging laundry on lines behind white-painted houses. Even the soldiers escorting us wore uniforms that looked freshly laundered, their collars clean, their boots oiled, their hair neatly combed. Now that same abundance stood inches from us in the form of basic hygiene, 3 times a day in America, but forgotten luxury to the rest of the world. As the steam thickened, the sergeant stepped forward again. He lifted a bottle of Palmolive shampoo from the shelf, turned it in his hand, and spoke to us gently. "It's for your hair," he said, tapping the label. "Good stuff. Smells nice." It was such a simple gesture, so casual that I almost laughed, but nothing about this was funny. There were women beside me whose bodies trembled from malnutrition, who had not seen a proper mirror in over a year, who had lost sisters and mothers and homes. And now, standing here in this humid room in Texas, they were being offered something their own government had not been able to give them in months: dignity. I watched the sergeant place the bottle back with exaggerated care, as though to show there was no trick, no cruelty hiding behind the gesture. The shock of it, this small, everyday American generosity, hit us harder than the journey across the Atlantic. Someone behind me whispered, "America must be rich to waste shampoo on prisoners." But it wasn't waste, not to them. It was policy. It was culture. It was who they believed they were. By 1944, the United States was producing more food, fuel, and manufactured goods than the entire Axis combined. Factories built bombers at a pace of 1 per hour. Liberty ships slid into the water every few days. The country fed its own citizens, its soldiers across 2 oceans, its allies, and yes, its prisoners. Even now, as the water warmed and fog washed over the ceiling, I could feel the weight of that truth settling into me. America could afford to be kind. The sergeant clapped his hands lightly, not as an order, but as encouragement. "All right, one group at a time. Who's first?" Nobody moved. Hot water, shampoo, towels, all offered freely to us. German women wearing enemy uniforms in the middle of a war. It was too much, too generous, too American. And in that moment, the true shock was not the steam rising from the pipes. The true shock was realizing that our captors were treating us with a humanity our own nation had long abandoned. The steam should have been comforting. Instead, it sounded like pressure building inside a weapon, hissing, boiling, warning. For a heartbeat, none of us breathed. The pipes overhead rattled as they warmed, metal expanding with a groan that echoed through the tiled walls. It was an ordinary sound in America, but to us, German women who had spent months living on fear and rumor, it felt like the tightening of a snare. I remember the first thought that tore through me. Shower. Death. It wasn't logic. It was instinct, trained, drilled, whispered into our ears from every direction of the Reich. Behind me, a woman named Marlena clasped her hands to her mouth. Bitte. Ingrid, don't step forward. Her voice cracked like thin ice. They do this. They take you in small groups. You shower, and then you disappear. Another woman grabbed my sleeve. Don't you remember what they told us aboard the ship? That the Americans use steam to suffocate prisoners? She was shaking so violently her teeth chattered. I did remember. Every word. Every warning we'd been fed since training. Americans tan sa tu bin trong fong tam. The pipes release gas. Women will be humiliated, violated, or simply vanish. It all came roaring back the moment the steam touched my skin. The hiss grew louder. The boiler thumped. A valve clicked sharply, and the women around me recoiled as if struck. Someone started sobbing. Another whispered prayers rapidly under her breath. A third woman slumped against the wall, sliding down until she sat curled on the floor, arms over her head as though bracing for an explosion. I felt the fear building inside me like a tide I couldn't stop. Back home, 1944 was the year everything began collapsing. The Eastern Front shrinking, the Allies pounding German cities day and night, food rations disappearing, and propaganda doubling in intensity because it was the only thing the Reich still had plenty of. They told us the Americans had no honor. They told us surrender meant torture. They told us the Geneva Convention was a myth, something only fools believed the enemy would follow. And yet, here we were, in a brightly lit room that smelled faintly of lavender shampoo, being given towels softer than anything I'd touched in months. The contradiction was unbearable. My rational mind whispered, "This is America. They're following rules. They're showing decency." But the propaganda buried deep within me hissed back, "Decency is the trick. Kindness is the trap." The two voices collided so violently inside my chest that my lungs tightened. The steam thickened. A droplet fell from the pipe overhead and struck the concrete with a sharp pat. Instantly, 3 women jumped away from it. Then, the young American private who had turned on the boiler stepped toward us, too quickly, and panic erupted. "Nain! Stay back! Don't touch us! Please, we're not ready! Don't close the door!" The private halted mid-step, stunned. His eyes widened a little, not with anger but with confusion, even concern. He lifted both hands slowly, palms open as if approaching wild, frightened animals. A female voice cut through the room. "Easy. Give them space." It belonged to the American nurse who had entered earlier. She moved toward us but deliberately stayed several feet away, respecting the invisible boundary of our fear. Her posture was calm, her expression steady. "It's all right," she said gently. "No one will touch you. Not unless you ask for help." Her voice had a tone American women seemed to master. Practical, warm, unwavering. It should have comforted me. It did, but only partly. She gestured toward the running showers. "The water's just water. Hot water. Nothing else." Marlene clutched my arm tighter. That's what they said in the stories, too. The nurse seemed to sense the depth of our terror. Her eyes softened, but her words remained firm. "You're safe here. This camp follows the Geneva Convention. That means you're treated as soldiers, not as criminals." She paused. "And it means nothing happens in this room except bathing." The claims were impossible to reconcile with everything I'd been taught. Safe. Geneva Convention. Respect. Our world in Europe had fallen so far into ruin that the concept of rules felt almost absurd, but the Americans lived by them. Not because they had to, but because they chose to. It was part of their identity, something their generation believed in fiercely, even while fighting a global war. The nurse picked up a towel from the bench and held it out toward us, not stepping forward, simply offering. "Whenever you're ready," she said. None of us moved. Fear had made statues of us. Finally, the sergeant stepped beside her. He didn't speak, not yet. Instead, he reached out slowly, took a bar of GI yellow soap, and held it under the stream of water. The bar sizzled faintly as foam bloomed around it, rising like a soft cloud. He nodded to us. "See? Nothing harmful." It shouldn't have been profound, but it was. An American soldier, one of the supposed monsters we'd been warned about, was demonstrating a bar of soap like a shopkeeper showing goods to customers. The nurse lowered her towel slightly. "You've crossed an ocean. You've survived things no one should survive. This is the easy part. We're just helping you feel human again." Her words struck something inside me I didn't know was still alive. Feel human again. I looked at the steam. I listened to the pipes. The hiss no longer sounded like a threat, only like water warming on metal. Ordinary, familiar, something I once loved. Slowly, one woman stepped away from the wall. Another followed, then another. Fear hadn't vanished. It still clung to our ribs and lungs, but something warmer had slipped between its cracks. Hope? Or maybe simply exhaustion from running from phantoms. The nurse stepped back, giving us room. "You decide when," she said softly. And in that moment, I realized the terrible truth. The Reich had filled us with fear to keep us obedient, but America, through nothing more than patience and decency, was unraveling that fear without firing a single shot. The moment someone finally stepped forward, it wasn't one of us. It was the American sergeant. Without a word, he unbuttoned his sleeves, rolled them up slowly, and walked straight into the shower stall. The steam curled around him, softening the sharp lines of his uniform. He reached for the nearest pipe, twisted the valve a notch higher, and let the water cascade directly over his head. Hot water. Clean water. Falling freely onto his face, soaking his shirt, darkening the fabric to a deep olive green. We stood frozen, stunned by the absurdity and strangeness of it. A soldier, an American soldier, was demonstrating a shower to the enemy like a father trying to convince terrified children that thunder couldn't hurt them. He tilted his head back, wiped the water from his eyes, and spoke gently. See? Safe. The steam carried his voice across the room, soft and sincere. The kind of tone no propaganda film had ever prepared us for. Behind him, the young private from earlier scraped his boot nervously on the floor, then stepped forward too. He pointed at the running water, searching for words he clearly wasn't trained to use. Water is safe, he said haltingly. Warm. Good for you. The sentence was clumsy, but the kindness was unmistakable. I felt something shift inside me, small, fragile, but real. A crack in the wall I had built around myself. The nurse, seeing our hesitation begin to loosen, gently placed a folded towel into my hands. It was warm from sitting near the boiler, soft in a way I had forgotten towels could be soft. She offered shampoo next. Palmolive, its green label familiar yet surreal in this place so far from home. Take your time, she said, stepping back again so we wouldn't feel cornered. Her distance was deliberate, a gift of safety. Marlene, still trembling at my side, whispered, "Why are they doing this, Ingrid? We're prisoners." I didn't have an answer, but the sergeant did, though he didn't speak it. He simply stood there in the warm rainfall, letting the water run down his sleeves, filling the room with proof that we had been wrong about so many things. Finally, one of the older women, Emilia, whose hair had turned gray long before its time, took a breath so deep her shoulders shook. Then she stepped forward. The nurse smiled. "Good," she whispered, more to herself than to us. "Very good." One by one, the others followed. When it was my turn, I felt my pulse hammering beneath my skin. The steam enveloped me immediately, warm and fragrant with soap. My hair, hard with months of dirt, began to loosen as the water soaked through it. I reached up with unsure fingers and felt it soften beneath my touch. The sensation was so strange, so intimate, that for a moment I forgot how to breathe. Then, just as I rubbed the bar of yellow GI soap between my palms, foam slid unexpectedly into my eyes. The sting was sharp, immediate. I gasped and stumbled sideways, momentarily blinded. Before panic could take over, a hand appeared in front of me holding a clean towel. I flinched, instinctively recoiling from the touch. The American private stood there, his arm extended, worry tightening his face. "Here, your eyes," he said softly. I hesitated. He didn't move closer. He didn't force the towel into my hand. He just waited. Slowly, I reached out. Our fingers brushed. For a split second, both of us froze. I felt him tense, not out of fear, but out of sheer awareness of the moment, as if he understood how delicate the boundary was between comfort and terror. I jerked my hand back slightly. "It's okay," he murmured, voice barely above the sound of the water, and somehow, impossibly, I believed him. I pressed the towel to my eyes, blinking away the soap. When my vision cleared, he was already stepping back to give me room again. Such a small thing. Such an enormous thing. These men, young Americans who could have treated us with contempt, anger, or triumph, were instead offering us dignity, quietly, patiently, without expecting anything in return. During the war, we had been told that Americans were weak, soft, corrupted by luxury. But this was not weakness. This was strength of a different kind. Looking around the room, I saw more moments of unexpected grace. The nurse guiding an elderly prisoner toward a less crowded stall, the sergeant handing a woman a fresh bar of soap after hers slipped from her fingers, the private demonstrating how to twist the valve gently rather than pushing it too hard. Nothing dramatic, nothing heroic, Just kindness. Pure, simple, human kindness. Later, when we dried our hair with thick American towels, each one large enough to wrap around us twice, I found myself staring at the nurses' boots. They were worn, scuffed from long shifts. Not new, not polished. Boots that had walked through barracks and hospital tents, through mud and sun and doubt. She caught me looking. "These," she said, tapping the toe of her boot with a faint smile, "have carried me through a lot of long nights. But caring for people, that's what they're made for. Caring for people, even us." In that moment, something inside me unraveled. My sense of enemy, my certainty about moral lines, my belief that cruelty was the only possible language in war. The Americans didn't share that belief. Their greatest generation had grown up with hardship, farms lost in dust storms, families surviving on almost nothing, men and women working double shifts in factories because duty demanded it. They had learned that kindness was not weakness during hard times, it was survival. And here, in this camp far from home, they were living that lesson with us. I realized then that we were seeing the true character of their nation, a character built not on victory or industry alone, but on compassion even toward those they fought. It was overwhelming, disorienting, and quietly wondrous. As I wrapped my clean hair in a towel, the sergeant passed by and said, "You'll feel better after this. Everyone does." I wanted to tell him that it wasn't just the water that made me feel different. It was him, them, the way they treated us as if we were more than the uniforms we wore or the country we came from. But my English was too limited, so I simply nodded. And for the first time since crossing the Atlantic, I felt something blooming inside me. A fragile, hesitant warmth. It was trust, not complete, not yet, but enough to remind me that despite everything the war had taken, humanity could still find its way between two enemies in a room full of steam. The moment I felt the water touch my scalp, truly touch it, I knew something inside me was going to break. Not crack, not bend. Break. The heat seeped through the tangled mass of my hair, sinking into the skin beneath, loosening months of dirt, sweat, and fear. And before I could stop myself, my knees buckled. The concrete floor hit me hard, but I barely felt it. The water kept pouring over me, washing down my forehead, my cheeks, my neck, until I couldn't tell what was water and what was tears. I wasn't crying yet, not fully, not in the way I would soon, but something deep, something I had kept locked away since the war began, shifted. Around me, other women were murmuring softly under the showers. Some gasped at the warmth. Some laughed nervously. Some whispered prayers. But their voices sounded far away, as if underwater. The only thing I could hear clearly was the steady rush of the shower above me, relentless and gentle at the same time. I lifted a hand and touched my hair. It felt alive again, heavy with water but no longer stiff. As the strands separated beneath my fingers, so did the memories I had tried to bury. My mother brushing my hair in front of the parlor mirror, the smell of soap drifting up from the basin, the feeling of being cared for, really cared for, before the world fell apart. The memories came back too fast, too brightly, and with too much contrast against the life I had been living. I pressed both, hands over my face as if I could hold them back. The soap slid from my palm, hit the floor, spun once and drifted toward the drain in a swirl of white foam. Something in me snapped. The tears came suddenly, violently, so much that I couldn't breathe. I crouched lower, folding myself into the smallest shape I could manage. The water rolled down my back like warm rain, but instead of comforting me, it made every emotion sharper. The foam gathered where I knelt, pooling around my wrists. My tears fell into it, creating small, perfect circles that disappeared as quickly as they formed. It felt like watching pieces of my old self dissolve. A soft voice reached me through the steam. "Ingrid." The nurse. Her shoes stopped just shy of the spray. She didn't touch me, not even close, but she lowered herself to a crouch so she could meet my eyes. Her expression wasn't pity. It wasn't even concern. It was something more human, more ancient. Understanding. I shook my head, unable to form words. My breath came in harsh, uneven bursts. I tried to say, I can't understand this. She didn't rush me. She didn't fill the silence with platitudes. She simply waited until my breathing eased enough that I could speak again. Finally, with my voice cracking into pieces, I whispered the only question that mattered. Why are you doing this? We are your enemies. The nurse's face softened in a way that made my chest ache. Humanity, she said quietly, doesn't stop because of war. The words hit harder than any shell I had survived. Harder than hunger. Harder than propaganda. Harder than fear. Humanity doesn't stop because of war. I had never heard anyone say that. Not in the Reich, not in training, not at the front, not even to comfort children in bomb shelters. In Germany, war consumed everything. Ethics, decency, tenderness, even truth. But here was an American nurse in a prisoner of war camp in the blazing heat of Texas, telling me that humanity was something they chose to carry with them anyway. I covered my mouth to keep from sobbing. It didn't work. A sound escaped me. A broken, animal sound I didn't recognize as my own. The water kept pouring over me, washing my tears into white streaks on the floor. Behind the nurse, the sergeant stood at a respectful distance. His expression was unreadable, but not cold. He had seen soldiers cry before. He understood breaking points. The private, the one who'd helped me earlier, shifted uncomfortably. He didn't know whether to look away or come closer. In the end, he stayed still, learning, absorbing, trying to grasp a depth of suffering he had never experienced. I pressed my palms to the wet floor and tried to gather myself, but the flood inside me had finally found an opening. It poured out in waves, grief, guilt, exhaustion, shame, relief, until I couldn't separate one feeling from the next. The nurse finally spoke again. "You've been carrying too much," she said. "Let it fall. The water will take it." I closed my eyes. The water will take it. And it did. It washed away the months of filth clinging to my scalp. It washed away the smell of fear embedded in my uniform. It washed away fragments of lies I had believed about Americans. It washed away the idea that all enemies must hate each other. It washed away the illusion that the Reich had ever protected us. In its place, something new began to grow, small, hesitant, unfamiliar. Respect, not for their power, not for their victory, but for their character. As I knelt there, trembling under the warm stream, the weight of the world shifted inside me. I saw Germany's desperation clearly, the shortages, the lies, the cruelty disguised as patriotism. And I saw America clearly, too, a country strong enough not to fear kindness. The nurse gently placed the shampoo bottle near me, careful not to intrude. "When you're ready," she murmured, "wash the rest." I looked at the bottle, at the steam, at the women around me, some crying quietly, some laughing through their tears, all of them overwhelmed in their own ways. Then I looked at the Americans, young, tired, sunburned, but still choosing decency. The contrast was unbearable. The contrast was beautiful. With shaking hands, I opened the shampoo and let the scent, fresh, unfamiliar, impossibly clean, fill my lungs. As I rubbed it into my hair, the bubbles formed thick and white, dripping down my arms, collecting at my elbows, sliding off my skin in spirals, bubbles and tears indistinguishable. And in that moment, I cried harder than I had since the war began. Not because I was hurt, not because I was afraid, but because I had just discovered something the Reich had spent years trying to hide from us. There is power in kindness. Real power. The kind that can break a person open, not to destroy them, but to free them. When I finally stood up again, unsteady but lighter than I had felt in months, the nurse met my eyes with a quiet nod. "Better?" she asked. I swallowed hard. "Yes, but I don't understand." "You don't have to," she said. "Just know this. What we're giving you isn't charity. It's principle. It's who we are. I didn't know the words for it then, but years later I would. Greatest generation. A generation that believed dignity wasn't a luxury. A generation that followed rules even when the world didn't. A generation that treated enemies like humans because they refused to become monsters themselves. As the water shut off and silence settled over the room, I realized something that made my chest tighten again. Germany might have commanded my loyalty. But in that moment, America had earned my respect. I thought the shower would be the end of my unraveling. But it was only the beginning. Because once you taste unexpected kindness, you begin seeing it everywhere. And in Camp Hearn, kindness lived in the smallest corners, quiet, unannounced everyday acts that struck me harder than the torrents of water that had washed me clean hours before. It began the next morning. I woke to the sound of boots on gravel and the distant hum of a generator. Sunlight filtered through the barracks window, soft and golden. My hair, clean for the first time in months, rested lightly against my cheeks. I touched it, still astonished by the softness. For a moment, lying on the narrow American cot with a real pillow beneath my head, I forgot I was a prisoner. Then the door opened and reality returned, but gentler than before. A young American guard stepped in, holding a small tin in his hand. "Aspirin," he said, tapping the lid. He didn't know much German, but he didn't need to. He pointed at Amelia, whose joints had been swollen from malnutrition. "You," he said, "pain." Then at Marlene, who had been coughing all night. "You too." It wasn't medicine from a battlefield. It wasn't rationed or stingy. It was aspirin, the kind you could buy in any American drugstore, but in Europe it had become rarer than gold. He set the tin on a table and left without waiting for thanks. Amelia stared after him as if witnessing a miracle. By mid-morning, another form of kindness appeared, louder, messier, and smelling faintly of pepper and frying oil. The camp cook. He was a broad-shouldered man named Red, with arms like tree trunks and a laugh that shook his whole rib cage. He marched into the women's compound carrying a tray piled with cornbread. "Extras," he said proudly. Then, slowly, as if translating inside his head, he corrected himself. "More. For you." His attempt at German pronunciation made several women smile. He seemed delighted. Back in Germany, cooks served soldiers. Here in America, a cook would feed his prisoners and smile about it. I didn't understand it. Not yet. But the more I watched, the clearer the picture became. That afternoon, a pipe burst behind the laundry shed. Water gushed into the dirt, turning the ground into thick mud. 2 American soldiers didn't wait for orders. They grabbed wrenches, knelt in the mud, and worked until the valve was replaced and the leak stopped. Later, when the generator powering our barracks flickered uncertainly, 3 more soldiers arrived with toolboxes. They argued playfully, cursing at screws and wires until the engine kicked back into steady rhythm. A warm hum filled the compound again. One of the men, his face streaked with grease, looked at the glowing bulbs overhead and muttered with satisfaction. "That's better. Can't have 'em sitting in the dark." Them, us prisoners. I stood there, absorbing every moment, feeling the fragments inside me shift into a new understanding. This was not how victors treated the defeated in the stories I had been told. This was not how Germany treated its prisoners. This was something else entirely. Later, that week, while gathering clean linens from the laundry line, I saw the nurse again, the one who had spoken words that rewired my heart. She nodded toward the barracks behind me. "You're adjusting," she said. I opened my mouth but didn't know how to explain what I'd been noticing. How every small gesture from the Americans felt like a message. How those messages were slowly forming a sentence I had never expected to read. She sensed my struggle. "You're wondering why," she said. I nodded. She folded a towel with practiced ease. "Well," she said, "a country that has plenty doesn't need cruelty to feel powerful." Her words struck me the way the shower water had struck me, Shock first, then understanding. Because Germany in 1944 had nothing left to spare. Every crumb was rationed. Every bomb shelter was overflowing. Every life was defined by scarcity and fear. But America had abundance. Food, soap, medicine, machines, electricity. And beneath it all, a moral confidence that made gentleness feel effortless. That evening, as I lay on my bunk, my mind drifted thousands of miles away, to Ford's Willow Run plant, which I had only heard of in propaganda broadcasts. In Germany, it was whispered about with a mixture of awe and fear. A factory that built a B-24 bomber every hour, a factory lit by endless rows of fluorescent bulbs. A factory lined with women, Rosie the Riveters, wielding drills and rivet guns with the strength of soldiers. And in ports along the American coast, Liberty ships rolled into the ocean in perfect rhythm, one after another, until the sea itself seemed filled with American steel. It wasn't arrogance, it wasn't propaganda, it was a simple fact. America was building the world while our world was collapsing. And that industrial power had a strange side effect. It made kindness possible. As I lay there, staring at the rafters above my bunk, I imagined the contrast. America sending aspirin to prisoners, Germany rationing medicine even for its own children, America repairing pipes in a POW camp, Germany rebuilding water lines in bombed-out cities every night, America giving clean towels to its enemies, Germany unable to give them to its own people. The differences were so stark they almost hurt to think about. But the deepest revelation came the next morning. As we lined up for roll call, the sergeant walked past us with his usual quiet presence. He paused when he reached me. "You look better," he said simply. I touched my clean hair again. "Yes." He nodded once. "Good." That was it. No speech, no triumph, just acknowledgement, human to human. And suddenly a truth bloomed inside me with breathtaking clarity. A truly powerful nation doesn't need to be cruel. Cruelty is the weapon of the desperate, not the strong. I inhaled sharply. For the first time since the war began, my perspective shifted not as a soldier, not as a German, but as a human being. And, in the quiet that followed, another realization took shape. One that belonged not to me, but to the Americans who would one day watch this story. A question whispered by the heart. We once treated even our enemies with dignity. When did we stop treating each other that way? Camp Hearn had become more than a prison. It was a mirror, showing us two nations, two philosophies, two futures. Germany tightening its fist around fear, America opening its hand with generosity. And I, standing in the space between them, began to understand which vision of the world would survive. I thought I had already reached the limit of what kindness could undo inside a person. But I was wrong. Because the moment that changed me most wasn't the shower, or the aspirin, or the repaired generator. It was a wooden comb. A simple, unremarkable American comb. Yet it struck me with more force than any artillery shell I'd survived. It happened on a quiet morning, several days after my breakdown in the showers. The Texas sun had just begun to heat the yard, drawing thin shadows beneath the barracks and filling the compound with that warm, dusty smell unique to this part of America. I was standing near the laundry line, trying awkwardly to separate the strands of my clean hair with my fingers. They kept snagging. Every knot reminded me of the months I had spent without the luxury of caring for myself. That was when the sergeant approached. He hesitated for a moment, not out of fear but out of respect, then reached into the breast pocket of his neatly pressed uniform. When his hand emerged, he was holding a small object wrapped in brown paper. "For you," he said, offering it with a quiet sincerity that startled me. I frowned, unsure whether I had misunderstood. He nudged it gently toward me. "Go on," he said. "Open it." I peeled back the paper slowly, cautious without knowing why. Inside lay a wooden comb, smooth, polished, carved with a simple American star on the handle. I stared at it, unable to speak. "You need it," the sergeant said almost apologetically. Figured it might help. Help? As if the word were that simple. As if what he was giving me wasn't the most personal, intimate act of dignity I had received since the war began. My throat tightened. I had gone so long without touching something made only for care. Everything in Germany had been built for survival, for war, for endurance. Even the coarsest household combs had vanished into the machinery of the Reich. But here, in my hands, lay a tool not meant to command or to destroy, but to restore. I ran my thumb along its teeth, feeling the fine craftsmanship of something ordinary and precious at the same time. The sergeant noticed the way my breath caught. "It's nothing fancy," he said, "just a comb." No, it was more than that. It was the first object since my capture that belonged to me, not because I needed it as a prisoner, but because I deserved it, as a human being. I felt my vision blur again, though no soap was stinging my eyes this time. "Danke," I whispered, my voice unsteady. He nodded and stepped back, leaving me alone with the gift. I held the comb for a long time before lifting it carefully to my hair. As its wooden teeth glided through the strands, untangling knots, smoothing what had been wild and neglected for months, I felt something inside my chest untangle too. For the first time since the war began, I felt whole. Not clean, not fed, not merely alive. Whole. That night I wrote in my journal, a small worn notebook that the camp allowed us to keep. America did not win because it was stronger. America won because it was kinder. I paused after writing it, surprised by how naturally the words had arrived, but the truth of them settled into me with undeniable clarity. Because every day in Camp Hearn brought another glimpse into the American soul. We were invited, yes, invited, to the recreation hall on Saturdays. A projector rattled to life as black and white scenes flickered across the sheet hung as a makeshift screen. Once, it was "It Happened One Night." Another time, a newsreel showing women in overalls, Rosie the Riveters, building airplanes at a speed impossible to fathom. I watched their faces, young, determined, unbroken, and felt a strange warmth expand in my chest. These were the women fighting the war from home, not with guns, but with strength and purpose, building a nation even as husbands and brothers fought overseas. On other days, the camp librarian delivered crates of books to our barracks, English novels, some German classics, even poetry. "Read," she said, tapping a crate, "keeps the mind alive." Back in Germany, books had become luxuries. Some burned in the streets, others hidden in cellars. Yet here, America gave books to prisoners. On Thursdays, those assigned to the garden walked through rows of tomato plants, herbs, and flowers, living things we were trusted to tend with our own hands. The air smelled of soil and sunlight. It reminded me that life continued even in captivity. Every gesture, every saved me. I had seen the news. I had heard the anger. I had felt the divisions crackling across the air like static, and I wanted America to remember who it once was. My story did not stay hidden. My granddaughter, born in Hamburg but raised in the United States after our family immigrated, found my journal one summer afternoon. She read every page, turning the brittle paper with reverence. When she reached the entry where I wrote, "America won because it was kinder," she began to cry. Years later, she would tell my great-grandchildren stories from that journal. And one day, at a family gathering, I heard her say words that stopped every conversation around the table. My grandmother always said, "America saved her humanity." The room fell silent, each person absorbing the weight of a sentence shaped by war, mercy, and memory. I looked at their faces, American faces, German faces, both and neither, and felt a warmth bloom inside me. This was legacy, not victory, not defeat, but the quiet inheritance of kindness. Sometime after that, when I was already well into old age, I visited a veterans' home in upstate New York to meet the man who had given me the wooden comb. The sergeant, now a frail figure with silver hair, sat in a sunlit courtyard, wrapped in a blanket despite the warmth. He recognized me before I even spoke. "Ingrid," he said softly. You made it." "Yes," I whispered, "because of you." He shook his head. "No, because of what needed to be done." I sat beside him, listening as he spoke with the slow, steady cadence of someone who had carried a long life of memories. "We didn't do it for praise," he said, "and not for politics either. We did it because that's who we were." Those words echoed the moral foundation of his generation, the quiet, unshakable belief that decency was not optional, that character mattered, that how one treated the defeated said more about a nation than how it treated the victorious. I thought of America today, louder, angrier, more fractured than the country I had first encountered through steam and soap and a wooden comb. And I wondered, as I often did, how could a nation that once treated its enemies with such grace forget how to treat its own people the same way? If a country could show mercy to a frightened prisoner in 1944, why did it struggle to show mercy to its own citizens now? If strangers in wartime could extend a hand across barbed wire, why were neighbors in peacetime turning away from each other? These questions weighed on me as I wrote the final lines of my letter. I ended it not as a former prisoner, nor as a German, nor even as an immigrant who had built a new life on American soil. I ended it as someone who had seen, firsthand, the height of American moral strength. Greatness is not something a nation shouts, it is something a nation shows. I signed my name beneath those words, Ingrid Weber, Camp Hearn, POW, Year 248, and folded the letter carefully. I did not know if it would ever reach those who needed it, but I knew the message was true. Allowance, every scrap of normalcy felt like part of a larger lesson. Treating enemies well makes America stronger. The Americans didn't say it outright. They lived it. Their decency was not strategic. It was habitual, cultural. Inherited from parents who had survived the Great Depression and taught their children that helping others, neighbor or stranger, was not a question of loyalty, but of character. And as I witnessed these small acts day after day, the comparison with my homeland became impossible to ignore. Germany was shrinking, starving, tightening its grip on every breath its citizens took. America was expanding, building, sharing, growing more generous even in war. One nation taught fear to stay in power, the other taught compassion to remain human. One night, sitting alone at a table in the barracks, I held the wooden comb again, feeling its gentle weight in my palm. I realized something quietly devastating. America had given me back pieces of myself I didn't know I had lost. And with that realization came an ache, not of pain, but of longing. A longing for a world where war didn't erase humanity. A longing for a home that had not taught me to fear kindness. A longing to become the version of myself I glimpsed in these moments of unexpected grace. It was then, with the comb resting against my heart, that a thought took shape. One that frightened me more than any threat the Americans could make. What if the nation I had sworn to fight for had never deserved such loyalty? And what if the nation I had feared was the one teaching me how to be human again? That was the moral awakening. Not loud, not dramatic, but deep. A shift so profound that even the quietest American gesture felt like an invitation. Remember who you are. Remember who you could be. Remember who we once were, and ask if we still are. And in that moment, I knew this truth with absolute certainty. Kindness is not weakness. It is legacy. Years later, long after the war had ended and the fences of Camp Hearn had rusted into the Texas soil, I found myself writing a letter I never expected to write. A letter to America. It began with a sentence I had carried inside me for decades. You did not just save my life, you saved my humanity. I wrote it slowly, carefully, afraid that if I rushed the words they would lose their weight. My hand trembled, not from age, though age had come, but from memory. The wooden comb, now smoothed by years of use, lay on the table beside me. I still kept it wrapped in the same brown paper the sergeant had used, a relic from a world that had changed me when I needed it most. As I wrote, the pages seemed to fill themselves with moments I could never forget, The warmth of the shower, the aspirin shared freely, the books in the barracks library, the nurse kneeling beside me as I cried, the simple truth she spoke. Humanity doesn't stop because of war. But I wasn't writing this letter for myself. I was writing it for a country that seemed, in my later years, to be drifting away from the version of itself that had. America in the 1940s had been a nation united not by perfection, but by purpose, by shared sacrifice, by a belief that dignity belonged to all, even to those who wore the wrong uniform. A nation strong enough to be gentle. A nation wealthy enough to be generous. A nation secure enough to be fair. I wanted desperately for that America to be remembered, to be reclaimed, not as nostalgia, but as compass. And so, with the last line of my letter, I wrote the words I hoped future generations would carry with them. If we want to rebuild this nation, we must remember who we used to be. When I finished, I set down my pen and looked again at the wooden comb resting beside me. A simple artifact worn smooth by time. But in its shape and weight and story, it carried the truth of a country that once chose kindness as its strongest weapon. And in that moment, I believed, quietly, fiercely, that it could choose that weapon again.